Thanks for stopping in. I guess we'll get started here. I'm Matt, and yeah, it's great to see everybody out here. See lots of familiar faces out there. Some people I don't know, but maybe we could chat over the next couple days. So welcome to the first day of the conference. Pretty excited to tell you guys about some of the performance improvements and enhancements that we've made based on what we've learned over 4+ years of working on YUI. So I'm going to just dive right in here. And we're going to be looking at this kind of from the code's eye view. Eric did a nice job this morning, if you caught his talk, of covering a bunch of these concepts from the high level with lots of pretty pictures and whatnot. I'm more into the code side of things, so we'll kind of dive in there a little bit. The first concept I want to talk about is loading the library, getting the library into your browser up and running, ready to go for your users to start interacting. So this probably looks fairly common. We've got a couple script includes embedded in your HTML. We've learned over the years from performance testing and whatnot that this isn't really the most efficient way to serve your files, but it'll get the job done. Some of the downsides to embedding your scripts this way, just to sort of give some background here, is, and this is all caveated, depending on the browser, some of these are more or less true, but it'll pause other assets from loading, block the rendering of the page, resolve dependencies is the nice thing there, though, because you don't have to worry about this script loading before this script, and that's kind of the reason that this embedding model works, because traditionally this script would halt loading of any subsequent scripts until it was loaded and executed. Then the next script would be ready to go, it would be ready to go for the next script. So in case there were any dependencies to work out or anything, that would take care of it for you. You might hear these referred to as blocking scripts. I'm trying to move away from that term a little bit just because browsers are getting smarter and smarter about this. So there's less blocking that's happening in the newer versions of some of these browsers, at least of the loading, are still blocking execution to manage the dependencies and things. Next approach here we'll look at is creating your scripts dynamically. So what we're doing here is we're creating some script nodes, giving them a source, manually loading those. So what's the difference here? Well, we're talking about dynamic scripts now, so those are taken right out of the normal browser rendering thread, if you will. And it allows your resources to load concurrently, doesn't block your rendering. However, your dependencies don't get magically resolved for you. In this context, you'll have to do something else, chain your onload listeners, ready states, etc., to manage that manually on your end if you do have the inner script dependencies. The next piece we've got here is what we're calling our combo handler. So what this does is allow you to dynamically decide which files you want to choose, or to statically include a URL like this, where you can say, I know exactly what I want. So it'll take both of these files, combine them into a single request, cache it after the first time it gets called, so that way any subsequent requests take advantage of that, and it works for both JavaScript and CSS. Obviously, those are handled separately. You get a script for your JS and links for your CSS. And so you can see here that we're pointing at Yahoo APIs. So we make all of our stuff available here from our CDN. Some people may want to roll your own or serve your own stuff. So you can actually use the PHP loader that we have. Chad's doing a talk on that tomorrow. So I encourage you to go check that out if you're interested in the PHP loader. It includes a thin combo handler as well. Dave's also hooked up a local client-side loader that you can grab off of his blog. So yeah, those are two ways to go ahead and just serve your own rather than, subjecting to the Yahoo APIs, although our uptime is pretty fantastic, so I wouldn't worry about that, but I understand that some organizations may be a little sensitive to who's hosting what where. Okay, so now we'll get right into YUI 3. So we've kind of taken these concepts and attempted to boil those into the architecture here. So what we're seeing here is a single script include, and then we'll go right ahead and start using stuff. Well, in this case, what you need to use anim didn't come with this initial script. But what's happening under the hood here is we're dynamically fetching all of the requirements that we know anim needs, and then your callback gets executed once everything is ready to go, and your scripts will run. So what does this do for you? Well, this is what we call the seed file. This is the lightest way to load the library. It'll give you something that you can throw in your page, 6K. It'll block, but it'll be a short amount of blocking happening, or embedded script action, if you will. And then you get 2 additional dynamic requests. One, it's going to bootstrap the loader, which will come in and it'll have all the metadata it needs, and then it will examine the dependencies and what you're using, and use its knowledge of the dependencies to go ahead and roll up a single request to the combo handler and take care of all that for you. Another approach that you can use here is to front load the loader as well. So this will help you minimize HTTP requests, and then it still does this subsequent additional dynamic request for any dependencies. So what you're looking at here is about 11K over the wire. Again, it's the same built-in dependency management you get for free. These are just different techniques that you can use, kind of depending on your needs. You can tailor this to your particular use case based on profiling and other tools that you run, which we'll look at a little bit. I'll talk about a couple tools that we like to use to measure the performance. A third way to do it is to go ahead and just create one big combo handled script, dump that into your page, and then you know, okay, all my dependencies are going to be there, and the use statement is smart enough to know, okay, well, if you say star, then we're just going to assume everything you need is already there, so we're just going to go ahead and provide you everything that is already available on the page. So what this does, though, is it gives you a heavier initial request. Again, this is an embedded script, so it could have some effects on your loading of other resources or the rendering of your HTML. But that might be good in some cases where you really do just want to take this hit up front. You've got some pseudo application functionality that's very script dependent, let's say. And you don't have to manually construct these crazy combo URLs. You can use our configurator. There's a nice little UI there where you can just say, okay, I'm going to need animation, and it'll fill in the whole URL series for you based on the dependencies. And here's the URL to that you can play around with. Okay, another concept that Eric briefly touched on was lazy loading. We'll get a little bit deeper into that and what does that actually mean here. So you can see here, if you've looked at YUI 3 at all, you're probably familiar with this use syntax with the Y instance callback. What that's essentially doing is once all of the dependencies for Node are ready, it passes in an instance of YUI that's your unique instance that won't be affected by any other instances on the page. You can do whatever you want there. It's sandboxed naturally with this anonymous function wrapper. But let's say you don't want to front load stuff that your user may not ever see or touch or use. Well, you can, depending on how you want to set it up. In this case, I said whenever somebody mouses over a calendar, I want to load the overlay, so then I can throw in my dynamic calendar. But I got lots of little calendar thumbnails on my page. They might never touch one of those, so I may not want to pull all of that up front. So you can see here we've got a nested use statement, still working off of our same Y instance. And then if overlay has any dependencies that aren't loaded yet, the loader will go out and get those and then execute this function when everything's ready to go. So that gives you on-demand loading and allows you to really fine-tune based on what the user needs rather than what you think the user might need in terms of what you're delivering to the page. And this will work for components that have a CSS file, it's smart enough to know that. So if overlay has its own style sheet, excuse me, it'll go ahead and pull that in as well. Another tool that we have is created by a non-YUI team member, but he's a fellow Yahoo, works on travel, Matt Sweeney. He introduced the image loader component way back in 2.1, 2.2, somewhere pretty early on. And what this allows you to do is defer the loading of your images, and then based on certain triggers, load them then. In this case, we're saying, okay, when somebody hovers over the tab set, load the background image for the control sprites, and load the source image for our image on tab 2. So it's kind of a nice way to not have to take all the hit for all your resources up front. This allows you to, especially in the case where you've got tabs that somebody may never touch, to not even worry about pulling those resources. Another way to use image loader is using class names, and additionally it's got this built-in functionality for checking below the fold. So if you give it a fold distance, it will check the offset below the fold. It does require you to hide your images before they start loading, otherwise there's going to be a race. So what we like to do is only hide them when JS is there, so that way JavaScript doesn't load for whatever reason, or less capable browser, bad request, what have you, the images will still show. And then in this case we're saying, okay, anything with the class name check fold, if it's below the fold, don't load it yet. So it'll run through and it'll find anything that matches that pattern and apply that rule to it. So again, this is similar to lazy loading, but for images, and it's kind of got a nice little API around it. It allows you to do the on-demand stuff with the custom triggers, including custom events. If you want to, react to something that's not a DOM event, you can do that if you're firing events from another component, and that's available along with all of our other components from developer.yahoo.com. It's our YDN site. Another way to load your own stuff in, say, a lazy loading kind of model is to use the get utility. And this is what we use under the hood for loader. This drives loader functionality. This is what comes with the seed file, bootstraps the loader. Loader comes in with all the metadata, does its thing. And you can go, Eric demonstrated how to add your own module and have its own dependencies and things. Well, that might be overkill in some cases. You just want to fetch a script or fetch a style sheet. Well, you can do that, and there's handlers for success and failure that you can hook into. Style sheet, that's going to just dump a link in and load it, so your styles will get applied when it's ready. And I won't read the slides here, but you get the picture. Okay, so we're going to move right into running YUI and kind of some runtime enhancements and improvements that we've made. So the first thing we're looking at here is your standard event listener. In this case, however, instead of adding it to one element, we're adding it to any element with the class name headline lives inside of a news module. So that's going to run through all these headlines, add a click listener to each one, and then make sure that the current target actually maps to one of the items that fits the pattern. If you're familiar with event bubbling, the target might be a text node or a node within within a headline, or yeah, that's about it. So this is another concept that Eric briefly touched on, event delegation. This is a way to manage a bunch of potential interactions with a single listener. So this is really nice when you have n number of things that you might be running through and touching each one to. What you can do here is you can just listen on an ancestor. All of those events will bubble up to the ancestor, and then you can route them from there. Well, the target will always be the thing that was interacted with. So what we're really interested in, though, is the headline. So what we're going to have to do is check, okay, well, did they click on the headline? No. Okay, well, then they probably clicked inside the headline, but they may have clicked something between the headline and its news ancestor, so we're going to go ahead and try to resolve that. And then if we have a note at the end of the day there, we know it's a headline. Now we can go ahead and do whatever we want to do with it. So this is kind of an example of how you would do manual event delegation in YUI 3. We've taken this one step further and built it into the library, so now all of your nodes come with a delegate method, which takes a similar signature to a normal listener. That last argument there is the scoped query to match, so that'll find all the headlines within the news module, and it will go ahead and clean up the current target for you, so you don't have to worry about any of this, what's the target, crawling up, etc. It's always guaranteed to be one of the headlines that they clicked on. So this can really be a huge performance benefit, especially during the cleanup phase of events, but also comes in handy if you've got dynamic content coming in, you're adding items, new headlines, and you don't want to have to actually manually add a new listener. All those clicks will just bubble up, and the ancestor that's delegating them will go ahead and route those as needed. So yeah, that's that. Another thing that we provide is a handle to detach your events. So you can see here the event subscription returns a listener. The listener has a detach method. This is one way you can detach events. There's a couple other ways. You generally don't need to do this unless you're really conscious of memory management in your application, or you've got a long-running application that you're potentially adding and removing things, and you want to be able to detach. When you destroy a node, you can optionally tell it to detach listeners. But this will always get cleaned up for you when the page unloads, just to keep memory down between browser sessions, especially in IE. Yep, that's that. Another interesting piece of the puzzle here is the later method. What this will do is allow you to take what would normally be a synchronous function, meaning it would just run in the normal flow of your program, and make it asynchronous. So now it's not going to your script isn't going to have to wait until this thing is done before it moves on to the next thing. So this is really nice when you could potentially have something that's going to take a while. You're not sure how long it's going to take. Your subsequent code doesn't care if it's done or not, because it's going to have its own callback to take care of whatever it needs to do. So in this case, we're saying, okay, in 0 milliseconds, run this function with null context. You can actually correct the context if you want to say, set this to something different. And that kind of comes in handy if you've got methods that are scoped to instances. And so then what happens here is when it gets done, finding all of the loading, we'll remove the class, and you don't have to worry about that stopping the execution of your script. Yeah, this helps keep your UI responsive, especially in a case where a long-running process can bog down the user experience. We really want to make sure that things feel snappy to the end user. Otherwise, they're going to assume it's a bad product. Okay. So what we're looking at here is using node instances. So node is like our DOM facade. This is this thing that wraps up DOM functionality and controls what happens to these underlying DOM nodes. And there's a one-to-one mapping, one node instance to one DOM node. Provides a DOM-like API plus some sugar and helper methods to do common tasks. And we've optimized these pretty substantially. And so you can do things like add snippets of HTML on the fly, remove elements without having to call parent node, remove child, element, all that fun stuff. And you can see in the first example there's some chaining there, so you can write a little bit terser code when the occasion arises to chain functions that don't have getters. Another thing that this does is it'll stop at the first match, so it won't run through and look for every one of these things. So it'll just find the first one and be done. So this is a great way to search for things by ID, or you're just looking for the first one of something. I don't know if you caught this here, but there's also a one method on a node instance. So what's happening in the second line under news there is it's a scoped query. So we're saying, okay, find all the loading messages, or no, sorry, find the one loading message under news, really the first, and remove it. And if you guys want to throw any questions, we can pause, but we'll also do a Q&A at the end here. So I'll try to slow it down a little bit so some of this can sink in. So now what we're looking at is the all method. This is a factory for creating node list instances. A node list is essentially a batch wrapper for node operations. So under the hood, it will use a single temporary node instance to kind of crank out all of the functionality that you need on each one of these nodes. And that's highly optimized as well. One of the nice things that allows you to do is avoid creating all these extraneous node instances. If you're just doing some one-off task, you don't need to make this a node, make this a node, make this a node. You just create one node list instance, run the function against that, and call it a day. Unlike node, obviously, it's going to look for all of the matches for the query you pass in. Okay, so that's kind of it for loading and running. In terms of performance, when we're talking about performance, well, before we start thinking about performance optimization or any of these kind of things, we should probably measure the performance, see what it's looking like, see what bubbles up to potentially need to be investigated for further optimization, etc. In terms of loading, a great tool that Yahoo provides is YSlow. Most of you are probably familiar with this. It's going to go ahead and analyze your page based on a number of rules that it knows about in terms of performance best practices, and give you a report card essentially based on that score. So you can see here one of the reports coming out of there, and right in line there it's going to have tips and recommendations for how to resolve some of these cases so that you can work towards your A grade. In some cases you're breaking rules. Hopefully you're understanding the rules before you start breaking them. In some cases you can't put your JavaScript at the bottom. In some cases you might not be able to combine all your requests, or on separate domains you're loading ad code, etc. Things like that. But yeah, before you start breaking the rules, it's really good to understand the rules, and this will also give you some great tips in terms of how to optimize your page load. It's also got some pretty graphs for analyzing the page weight. There's one with an empty cache, there's one with a prime cache, and it'll show you kind of the difference there, and you can sort of look at that and see, okay, in terms of the overhead for this page, what are we looking at here? Where should I start thinking about breaking things up, or potentially lazy loading some things, deferring some things? So you can see here we got 130K of JavaScript. It'd be interesting to know, well, of all of that JavaScript, how much do we really need during the loading phase? Is it possible to start deferring some of this stuff? So yeah, if you haven't already, you should have the YSlow Firebug plugin and run that against your sites. It's a great first step towards making your initial page view come up quick. That was a good segue into Google PageSpeed, which they provided, I think, earlier this year, maybe late last year. There's some overlap with YSlow in terms of kind of known rule sets and a score that it'll provide you. One of the really cool things that it has, though, is this profile deferrable JavaScript, which answers the question, previously we've got all this JavaScript loading, what of that can we take out of the mix? So if you enable this option, then you'll get as part of your overall report some kind of breakout about the amount of script. So in this case, over 80% of the script isn't used before the onload gets called. So that could be a good place to start looking for things to defer. Then there's also an activity panel as part of page speed. This is kind of like a net tab, except it's a little juiced up here. One of the cool things that it'll do is it'll break out JavaScript parse phase, JavaScript execution phase, and you can visualize which parts of your script might be taking longer than others. Are these things affecting the overall load? You can kind of see some waterfall happening here, so it looks like there's some blocking going on that we may want to investigate and potentially defer some of that stuff. So great first step in terms of looking for what we're going to do to get this initial view up quicker. And you can see up here we've also got these buttons for show uncalled functions and show delayed functions. Well, those will give you a report of all of the explicit functions that it knows were not called during up to onload firing. And it'll also show you functions that were never called at all. So they may or may not be needed. You may have some component that was never interacted with, so those scripts were never executed. Those might be a good candidate for a lazy loading technique. Like YSlow, it's a Firebug plugin. Highly recommend you grab that and use that, and start thinking more about how do I manage my resources, especially as we're just throwing more and more stuff in the browser, and really wanting to keep the initial view up quick, keep things responsive. Nicholas Zakis contributed a profiler component to YUI2 and has ported it to YUI3. This is a great tool for doing cross-browser profiling. If you're not familiar with profiling, this is a way to register various portions of your application to give you a report based on how many times it was called, how long did it take to execute, what was the max, min, average, those kind of things. And ideally, a profiler will give you some results that you can export and analyze in interesting ways. The YUI profiler does all of this for you. As we kind of move down the list here, you can see some of the different ways you can profile things. You can register a single function for profiling. In this case, the node list factory. We want to see, okay, how long is it taking to crank out these node lists? We may want to profile a whole instance and see, okay, everything that happens to a node instance I want to know about. So when you register a constructor, what will happen is it'll run through and instrument all of its prototype methods for profiling. And then the third way is if, say, you've got a static object that's got a bunch of methods hanging on it, well, then you can just register your object. This is how event is designed. In this way, it'll do the same thing. It'll run through and it'll instrument all the methods on this object, and all those will be included in your report. Additionally, there are oftentimes you don't want to just time functions, but blocks of code or larger sections of code. There's also the stopwatch style functionality that you can use to say, start a timer, name it, and do whatever you need to do, and then stop the timer. Nice thing about this is that all gets rolled into your report, so you'll see that along with the rest of your profile data. Here's a sample report. As I mentioned, you get fields for how many times it was called, what's the average speed, min, max. Points is kind of interesting, especially if you're trying to export this and do some, say, charting or other visualizations. You could do a scatter or some other diagram to see, okay, visualizing each of the calls. Yeah, the results are JSON, so they're easily portable if you want to pull those into a table, or if you want to send those to your server and collect those and be able to compare those with other browser results. All of those things are easily enabled here. So I do have a couple more slides here. This is an interesting area of discussion on some other tools that have popped up. This one in particular seems to get a lot of traction out there, and people seem to think that this is the end-all, be-all of performance measuring and what determines the performance of a library. So I would caveat that by saying, in most cases, we rarely see selector queries bubbling up in profiling. So from my perspective, this isn't really hugely important. It's more important for YUI 3 now that we've got the selector engine embedded into the core, everything running on top of that. In YUI 2, it's an a la carte module that you can use to pass around your collections of elements to other methods that operate on the collections. What we're looking at here is a CSS2 only selectors, and I've kind of whittled some of those down just so I could cram it into the slide here. And these are results for IE7, which is really the only one that matters anymore. Well, really IE less than 8 or IE8 in compat mode or IE8 in works mode. So all the other A-grade browsers now have their own native query engines, so you'll basically see 0s, 1s, and 2s down the line, which will make that even less of an issue. So again, I think that this is an interesting tool, especially for kind of comparing your versions against each other, make sure you're moving in the right direction. Also to test out various selectors and see how they perform. Just in case you're wondering, is this more optimized than this, etc. And it's real easy to pull the SlickSpeed test suite down and just update the selectors list and add or remove any tests from there. It's also really easy to add another library if you've got your own thing or there's another one floating out there that you want to see some results on. You can go ahead and do that. You can see we've been making improvements on this. YUI 3 is significantly faster than YUI 2. But again, all of that's kind of a grain of salt. Yeah, so for those that aren't familiar with SlickSpeed, what it is measuring JavaScript selector queries. You might get the impression that it's measuring CSS parsing or something like that, but this is really a manual implementation of JavaScript query or forking to a native query. Again, primary use case IE, and here's the main repository. I went ahead and threw up the test, the kind of the full CSS2 test that has the ones that I stripped out there. So if you wanted to go ahead and play around and run those on your own, feel free. If you're seeing results that are wildly different, or you want to discuss that, I'd like to talk about that a little bit more. So the other one is kind of piggybacked off of SlickSpeed, uses the same kind of foundational PHP and everything, and unlike Selector, though, it doesn't have a simple set of tests that you can run against every browser. You have to manually instrument all of these tests based on whatever the syntax might be for these various libraries. So this one's a little more tedious to add tests to. This one also, to me, is more meaningful than SlickSpeed. Now we're really getting into the area where you're touching the DOM. This is probably the foundation of most of the work you're doing in the browser. So we want this to be really fast. Again, I'm including these other libraries as a basis for comparison, and also to just sort of address any performance concerns that YUI users might have out there. Ultimately, we're competing against pure DOM. In my mind, if you can't get close to a pure DOM approach, then personally I would be less inclined to use a library and more inclined to just use the DOM. So that's our goal ultimately, is to close the gap between the pure DOM. Pure DOM, in this case, the asterisk just says there's basically pure DOM functions only with a couple of utility methods for basic selector, query, and add listener wrapper kind of thing. Yeah, so here it is on GitHub, the original task speed repository. And again, I went ahead and threw this up on YUI library. So if folks want to play around with that and compare results, feel free to grab me and talk about any of that stuff. So that's all I have. If anybody had any more questions about any of that, we've got a few minutes. We could talk a little more. We could just break early here. Anything? Okay. Well, I'm going to be around for the next couple days. I'd love to meet you guys and talk about things like performance, things about the core architecture, animation, CSS, Node, any of that kind of stuff. So if you're interested and want to strike a conversation or have any other questions, you want to grab me offline, feel free. Appreciate it, and good day.